Thus, if a homosexual is the victim of an offense as minor as vandalism, trespass, or threat, states are forced to determine if the offense were motivated by prejudice, a highly problematical and even tedious task. If so, details of the homosexual's case are to be forwarded to the federal government. If the person or group who committed the crime had not yet been found, the government's policy of sharing information concerning the case with state and local agencies might help to apprehend such persons. Thus, the long arm of the federal government could come to the aid of a homosexual victim in a way that would be out of the question for victims of crimes not motivated by prejudice.
But the ADL wants the Justice Department to do more than simply record and share data. It wants federal prosecution of those who hate. So far, this has not been fully possible because the federal government lacks authority to, 1, fully define for the states what constitutes a violent hate crime, especially in regard to homosexuality. This bill would have given homosexuality virtually the same protection which race, religion, and gender now enjoy. 2, determine the penalty for a violent hate crime. 3, invade states' rights in law enforcement, except in 6 special circumstances, such as jury tampering, voting fraud, interstate commerce, and so on. If the Local Law Enforcement Enhancement Act of 2000 had been passed, the federal government would no longer have been restricted in its right to intervene in racial, religious, or ethnic violence on the state level. Nor would homosexuals any longer be without special federal protection. This act would have vastly increased the government's right to, 1, define a violent hate crime, especially as it applies to homosexuals. 2, determine and enhance punishment for violent hate crimes. 3, at will invade state jurisdictions to enforce anti-hate laws.
This bill would have been a stepping stone toward an anti-hate bureaucracy. Eventually, Christian teachings condemning sodomy could be considered hateful. Fortunately, as a result of national alerts by Christian conservative leaders such as Dr. D. James Kennedy, a Republican House of Representatives was able to recognize the danger in this bill and defeat it. Yet the ADL never gives up. In 2001, a new, nearly identical bill was reintroduced to further the ADL agenda of ending free speech in America. Of course, this new bill, S-622, does not hint that its ultimate objective is to end free speech. Rather, it requires federal jurisdiction and stiffer penalties only for violent hate crimes. Surely everyone agrees that violent crimes of hate, such as the Oklahoma City bombing, should be severely punished. Yet if S-622 is passed, in a few years the ADL will orchestrate further legislation to achieve its true objectives. Tomorrow's legislation will amend S-622 to include hurtful speech as a hate crime. Such speech will be dramatized as the underlying cause of hate-motivated violence. Such thought crimes will then be prosecuted under a federal law enforcement apparatus originally set up only to punish physical acts of hate-motivated violence.
If hurtful speech is outlawed, power over the accused will be in the hands of those who define what hurtful speech is. If it means criticizing an identifiable group of people, then such criticism will be against the law. What is hurtful speech? Under existing laws, verbal threat against the safety of persons or groups is called harassment or intimidation. Such threat is adequately criminalized under state law. Why isn't the ADL content with such state laws? Because they don't outlaw the ADL's true enemy. The ADL's enemies are those like my wife and myself, who out of love for the Jewish people are morally obligated to criticize Zionism's bad leadership and false teachings. Yet the ADL wants to transform any criticism of matters Jewish into anti-Semitism, a form of hate. For the ADL, the criteria of whether a crime or even an editorial is anti-Semitic is whether it contains anti-Jewish criticism. Thus, in congressional testimony promoting anti-hate laws, the ADL says, anti-Jewish statements constitute clear evidence of anti-Semitism. Of course, Jesus and the Old Testament prophets scathingly tongue-lashed the people of Israel for their sins. If the ADL definition of anti-Semitism is correct, and criticizing Jews and their religion is hateful, then Christ and the biblical prophets were among the most outspoken anti-Semites the world has ever known. Instead, they resorted to verbally violent language in hopes that such tough love would shock the Jews into repentance and save their souls. Yet if the ADL has its way, the modern counterpart of the Old Testament prophets, those who out of concern for Israel criticize it for its sins, could become guilty of hate crimes. Christian missionary organizations which criticize Judaism for rejecting its Messiah and attempt to convert Jews away from it could eventually be indicted as haters. For the ADL, little has changed since those who criticized the Jewish people were stoned.
Thus, while promoting freedom for Jews, the ADL has a proven record of subtly working to limit freedom for others. Ultimately, the ADL will pressure the government to extend the term hate crime to include hurtful words against identifiable groups. Anyone who heckled marchers in a gay pride parade would then have committed a criminal act. Ultimately, even pastors who heaped guilt and shame upon sinners might be open to the charge of hurtful words.
You may ask, what possible motivation could this Jewish civil liberties organization have for curtailing free speech? The answer lies in the ambitions and destiny of Israel.
The biblical prophets, such as Isaiah, foretold a day when Judaism will no longer be accosted with opposition and criticism. The role of the ADL for the last 3/4 of a century has been to help create such a worldwide criticism-free zone for Israel. Israel's first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, in a Look magazine article, gives us more than a hint of the new world order presided over by Israel, which Zionism and the ADL are working to create. All continents will become united in a world alliance at whose disposal will be an international police force. All armies will be abolished, and there will be no more war. In Jerusalem, the United Nations, a truly United Nations, will build a shrine of the prophets to serve the federated union of all continents. This will be the seat of the Supreme Court of mankind to settle all controversies among the federated continents, as prophesied by Isaiah. Describing the aspirations of Zionism, Sir Winston Churchill, writing in the Illustrated Sunday Herald of February 8, 1920, also presents what amounts to a prophetic description of how the ADL would someday be assaulting freedom. It may well be that this same astounding race may at the present time be in the actual process of producing another system of morals and philosophy as malevolent as Christianity was benevolent, which, if not arrested, would shatter irretrievably all that Christianity had rendered possible. It would almost seem as if the gospel of Christ and the gospel of Antichrist were destined to originate among the same people.
Few Americans realize that already in such countries as Sweden, West Germany, Britain, Israel, and Canada, laws banning hurtful words against groups of people are already on the books. In Canada, if we follow a 25-year-old paper trail of newspaper articles, court documents, and articles in the Jewish press, we find again and again two organizations which have played the pivotal role in making hate laws happen. They are the Canadian colleagues of the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith Canada, and the Canadian Jewish Congress. Other groups may be involved in the externals of anti-hate lobbying, yet both behind the scenes and in the forefront, the Canadian Jewish Congress and B'nai B'rith Canada provide the focus and energy for Canada's rapidly evolving thought crime statutes. As a result of their tireless lobbying efforts, the Canadian Parliament in 1971 banned all written or broadcast statements which seek to cause humiliation to certain identifiable groups.
Under such laws, Dr. Paul Cameron, nationally recognized opponent of gay rights, made arrangements for a public lecture in Canada in which the homosexual lifestyle would be criticized. When he arrived at the border, the cases of books and literature he brought with him were impounded. He was told that in Canada it is against the law to humiliate homosexuals publicly.
As anti-hate legislation goes before Congress, the media continue to focus on racial violence, holding up the Aryan nations, the Ku Klux Klan, and skinheads as examples of what society should outlaw. Yet it is you and I, thinking Christians of a conservative bent of mind, who are in danger of being silenced. While gays, communists, abortionists, and radical feminists are not seen as those who hate, every kind of right-winger from Jerry Falwell to the Aryan nations is increasingly perceived as a source of hurtful words. In fact, Christianity itself is coming under scrutiny as a source of hate. Christianity, because of its belief in absolutes of right and wrong, is increasingly viewed as intolerant and judgmental.
A major reason why anti-hate legislation is so dangerous is that the definition of prejudice, the condition it claims to oppose, is ambiguous. A pastor would not think it a form of prejudice to warn a homosexual from his deviant, soul-damning lifestyle. Yet gay rights groups and the ADL would. Testimony of the ADL before Congress makes it clear that the ADL is pushing hard for national acceptance of its definitions. The ADL would prefer that, number one, federal definitions of prejudice be modeled after the point of view of the ADL. Number two, law enforcement personnel should defer to ADL definitions of prejudice when filling out reports on criminal investigations. And three, law enforcement personnel should submit themselves to ADL-led sensitivity training, making them compliant with ADL definitions of prejudice. Further, the ADL requests from Congress that investigating officers should be allowed to determine before trial whether the accused is motivated by prejudice. This would set up the local police, assisted by the ADL guidelines, as a sort of preliminary jury. This power over the accused is very ominous because if prejudice is determined, the ADL wants the crime considered much more serious with a stiffer sentence.